Reminder, this is going to be recorded. We will distribute the slides, the recording, and a few other materials after this presentation. It will take probably a couple days for the presentation recording to be made available, so just bear with us, but all of the other materials we'll be able to distribute fairly quickly. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
Ashley, I don't want to interrupt, but I did just get a message that someone is not able to hear us. So I'm going to share in the chat the call-in number as well. And I will post about that just in case we're experiencing that from anyone else.
Sounds good. Our format today is going to be just like the last time. We are going to walk through these slides in advance and then do Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We will monitor the chat and go through the chat's questions at the end. And it's also just a good way for you to log whatever your questions are as they come into your head. I don't think we'll need the full 2 hours as we said before, but I wanted to make sure that we all had as much time as possible just in case there are a lot of questions. I'm going to go ahead and just make these slides a little bigger. Okay. So we will be joined by Jasmine Clemens, who you all may remember from the last webinar. She will be joining us soon, and Bernadette Eichmann from our team as well. Okay, so let me just move out of my way. Okay. So as you all are aware, Baltimore County has set aside $1.3 million of our ARPA funds for this grant program. We received a minimum total amount of 3.8 million in requests, and we're currently considering 3.5 million in a minimum amount of requests, which means that all of the groups who have been invited to submit full applications, taking into account that your minimum ask has to be 25,000 per project. This means that we have a minimum ask currently right now that we could potentially try to fund of 3.5 million. So I just wanted to make everyone aware that it is going to be very competitive, and we will not have enough funds to fund everybody's asks fully at all. So as you all know, the minimum grant request is 25,000. Because of the amount of minimum ask that we have, we're most likely going to partially fund a lot of projects. I don't know that we'll be able to fully fund a ton of projects, but I would just plan for your projects to be, if they are funded, to be partially funded. And I just wanted to say that up front because these are federal dollars. These are there are a bunch of guidelines from the U.S. Treasury about using this money and being responsible with it. Just wanted to make sure everyone keeps in mind that as they are describing their projects in your application, take into account that if you do receive any funding, it will likely be a partial fund. So account for that and make arrangements for how you would be able to complete the project if you only received partial funding from the county. Projects submitted in this stage, they must be the same projects that your organization submitted in the pre-proposal stage. So this means that if you submitted 2 projects in the last stage, let's say one for a vaccine clinic and one for a food pantry, those have to be the same projects that you submit in this phase. We will be checking and cross-referencing with your pre-proposal packets to make sure that you are not submitting an entirely new project that you didn't identify in the previous stage. If you are an organization that did submit 2 or 3 projects and you have decided that maybe at this stage you would only like to submit 1 or 2 of those 2 to 3 projects, that is fine. But it must be one of the projects that you identified already in the last stage. And again, the funds have to be obligated by December 31st, 2024 and spent by December 31st, 2026. So we have already received a couple questions about, is this funding for multiple years? So yes, it can be. If your project requires several years of funding, that is fine. It's just that money has to be spent by the last day of 2026, and it all has to be obligated by the last day of 2024. So please just keep those deadlines in mind as you complete your applications. Hold on one second. Now I can't get my screen to move on. Here we go. Okay, so again, the projects must remedy the COVID-19 public health emergency or its negative economic impacts. So we talked about this in the last webinar. This money is from the federal government, and it is there specifically to fund projects that relate to the COVID-19 public health emergency. So we cannot just fund projects that have nothing to do with it. Everybody that has been invited to move forward. The projects that you identified in your pre-proposal were you, we're identifying effects of the COVID-19 public health emergency enough that we felt comfortable asking you to elaborate further on your project, which is why you're in this next stage. But please just keep in mind that your projects have to be related to COVID-19, and they can either be direct projects or indirect projects. Again, direct project would be a mobile vaccine clinic, something that responds to the effects of the COVID-19 public health emergency and solely attributable to that. An indirect project may be something like a tutoring program because of learning loss, or just like a community food pantry or workforce development program because of job loss or things like that. So again, all of these things that I'm describing these are not guarantees that those types of projects will be funded, but those are just some examples of direct projects and indirect projects for this application. So again, this is a competitive grant. This is not a time-sensitive grant, so we will be scoring all of the proposals that come in at once and funding the highest scoring proposals, and we will get into some components of that a little later on. Only complete applications will be scored. And we did expand the deadline. We pushed it back by 1 week. So it used to be, if you'll recall, looking at the materials from the pre-proposal questionnaire and the website, we had originally said the date would be September 2nd, and we have pushed it back by 1 week to September 9th, just to give everybody a little bit of extra time to complete their applications and just be as thorough as possible. We will still announce the awards in November of 2022. And again, we may fund all of your projects, none of your projects, some of your projects, partially fund, multiple ones. We reserve the right to do that depending on the funds and the strength of your application. So we just, again, want to make it clear that just because you've been invited to move on to this next stage in this process is not an automatic guarantee of funding. It's not a guarantee that if you submit more than one project, they will all be funded or they will all be partially funded. We just want to make that clear up front. So now I'm going to just walk through the different stages of the application. Everybody, when they were invited to move forward in this process, should have received an email with a link from Maya Smith from the Baltimore Community Foundation. Maya can't be with us today, but she is your tech support person. Because this port application is housed by the Baltimore Community Foundation, if you're having any tech issues, you can't get something to upload or download or complete, Maya is your contact person for that, and her contact information is at the end of this presentation. As many of you may have seen, the first few things that we're going to ask for are just your standard contact information, the address, the name of your CEO or president, the contact person submitting this application, your DUNS number again, all of that information, and that will all auto-populate for you if you choose to submit more than one project. And so we had mentioned in the previous webinar that if you choose to submit more than one project, what you will have to do is complete this application for each project, but by making an account on BCF's website, all of that basic information will auto-populate for you so that the only information you will then have to add is your project-specific information. So we're going to look at an organizational background, provide a summary, your mission statement, your organization's activities, your COVID-19 financial support. So we would like to get a complete listing of all your past and current COVID-19 financial support from all institutions with the dollar amounts. So this includes if you got a PPP loan, if you applied for a previous Baltimore County COVID-19 grant, a state grant, whatever the COVID related financial support that you got is, please list it and include how much you got. We also want to take a look at the Baltimore County financial support that your organization has gotten. That's not just COVID related, just generally speaking within the past 3 years, so 3 calendar years. The name of the funding program. So if you have received an arts and sciences grant, that would be the name of the program. And then the department would be, the Department of Economic and Workforce Development, and then the dollar amount of that award. So we would like to know all of that. And that information is so that we can get a sense of, the nonprofit landscape in the Baltimore County area, and just sort of, who we have relationships with, and who, may be new to working with us and receiving money from us. So those questions are just our way of doing a landscape of what's out there, and who has a relationship with Baltimore County and who doesn't, just so as we move forward as a county, we can do more to sort of fill gaps. And then we want to get into the project information for your application. So we want to know, your total requested amount per project. So, 150,000 for project A, and the name of the project. Every project does need to have a name. A description of the project, a description of the Baltimore County population that the project will support, and the location. So when you're describing your project, we want to know that this project is primarily located in the Windsor Mill area, and the population is, seniors, children under 5, workforce age adults, so on and so forth. The demographic information, if possible. Um, we want to know as much detail as possible about the project and who we're serving. So again, we can have that map of what's going on in the county, and how we, the county, can make sure that we're helping equitably. And then how will the proposed project address the negative impacts of the COVID-19 public health emergency? This is very important. Again, this money is federal money that is going to fund projects that address the COVID-19 public health emergency. So we need you to be as specific as possible about how your project does that. So we have shared information before, and we are happy to share it again from the Treasury about, sort of like what qualifies as a direct and indirect project for this purpose. But this is really where we need you to make the case that your project deals with the COVID-19 public health emergency, because if it doesn't, we can't fund it at all. So the more detail, the higher the level of specificity with this question, and with all questions, the better, as it relates to getting your project funded. So we're going to need a description of the project performance measures, inputs, outputs, outcomes. So there should be an example for you. I believe it's this example in the portal itself, just in case you need it. But we really, really need all of this very specific information. Again, because it's federal money, because the county is going to have to be reporting, and continues to report to the federal government on how the ARPA dollars are spent. We need you to be as specific as possible about, what you are planning to do and how, so that as we continue to report to the Treasury, we can include that information. So we want to know your project inputs, the example below. If you're doing a vaccination clinic, the number of nurses hired, number of vans that you might have purchased for the mobile vaccination clinic, your outputs, the number of individuals vaccinated, and your outcomes. So the decrease in new COVID cases in your target population. So these are all questions that need to be completed for each project. So again, if you are submitting more than one project, you will have to do a new application for each project. Your basic information will auto-populate, and all of this project information will remain blank so that you can complete it for that specific project. Then we're going to need a detailed project timeline, including a reporting schedule. So we want to, have you identify all of your project's milestones, how you'll track them. What is your plan for ensuring that your reports are all completed in a timely manner? This is very important too, because we need to be able to, as we again report to Treasury, we need to be able to show exactly what is being achieved with each report that we submit. And as subrecipients, you will also be subjected to a lot of reporting, which Gabby will talk about in a little bit, and which we will have another webinar for those organizations that we choose to fund. We will go through in much more detail some of the reporting you'll be required to do before you actually have to sign your grant agreements. But we would like a very detailed timeline so that we know exactly, what you're hoping to achieve and when, and, what that progress looks like. Then we would like a description of your performance management plan. So this can be, is there an opportunity to upload letters of support? No. Those are not necessary. And I know I shouldn't have answered a question while we're still going, but it just happened to pop up on my screen. So again, we need you to give us a detailed performance management plan for your project. So any management systems that you'll be using to track and spend your funds. Spending your funds and keeping track of that is extremely important, as we have gone over many times before, and which all of you as organizations who receive funds are well aware. But we just want to make sure everyone is being as thorough as possible so that when we all report back up to the federal government, we don't have to spend any time going back and forth with you guys. Um, you know, any sort of um, tools that you are using for management purposes. If you are using like a type of software, if you are using any sort of like project management certification techniques, this would be a good time to sort of list those and explain how you're using them. Describing how you will maintain your files throughout this life cycle of your grant, what your plan is for that. Do you plan to keep a paper copy of everything in a specific location and give these people access to it, as well as a digital copy that you will keep on a server? And, they will be looked at this amount of, times per month, and, checked by this outside source, that kind of thing. We would like to know your project team and their assigned duties and responsibilities. So that includes, the project manager, who is responsible for overall project X, Y, and Z, down to, we plan to have a subcontractor who is going to um, install shelving for our community food pantry freezer. Your team hierarchy. So we would like to see how, that management flows for this project, um, how you plan to manage your team. So if, everything is remote, we would like to know that. If you plan to have everybody on site for something or do weekly check-ins or something like that, we want to know exactly how you plan to manage this project. So all of these things are incredibly important. These are ways that we can kind of see that you've demonstrated that you will be very good stewards of these funds moving forward. We also want to know how your project goals will be determined and measured. So if you're hoping to do a mobile vaccination clinic, and one of your goals is we'd like to vaccinate, 100 people a week. How do you plan to measure that? How did you come to that number? What steps the project team will take to meet the goals and address any sort of missed goals or missteps, and any other project management details. So again, with the steps your team will take, if you're having a mobile vaccination clinic, perhaps one of the steps might be that your team will have everybody sign in or do a check in with everybody who received a vaccine 2 days later, um, and how you might address missing that goal for the week. So one of our staff, or we have a technological failure and we're not able to access everybody 2 days after they are vaccinated. What will you do to um, make sure that you get that information moving forward. Again, we just want to make sure that everybody has thought through this project from start to finish. All of this information is very important for us to make a decision and for the reporting for Treasury in the future. Identify at least one risk that may hinder successful completion of your project and any steps your organization will take to mitigate it. So identifying a risk is not going to reflect poorly on your application. So if there is a significant risk, like you're building a food pantry on a fault line or something, and I'm just picking a ridiculous example, but we are not going to hold it against you for identifying a risk. We would like to see that you have identified a realistic risk for your project and thought through a plan for how you would address it. That's really important for this application. How does your project address equity within Baltimore County? Equity is a very important thing that is a requirement with this money from the federal government. So we are asking you to take a moment to have a thoughtful response to that question. We are looking to make sure that everything that we do with ARPA money is equitable within the county. So we would like you to take a moment to just provide an answer to that question. And then you will attach a detailed project budget. An Excel document is acceptable for a project budget. If you have something else that you'd like to use, a PDF, you're welcome to use that. But we would like it to be detailed. We would like to know, what all of your costs are over time from start to finish. If you are hiring, what the salaries and the fringe look like for that over time, as much detail as possible. So I believe that in addition to the detailed project budget, you can submit, if you run out of space for these other questions, you can submit those answers in a Word document or PDF document and upload that to your application as well. So I believe you are able to do that. If you have any issues with uploading and attaching documents, again, Maya Smith will be your contact person and her information is at the end of this presentation. So as I've mentioned, all of those project detail questions are for your project. So if you are submitting 3 projects, you will have to answer all of those for each project separately. The reason that we have to do it this way is that when you complete the portal for your application, you will get a grant ID number. So we need each project to have its own grant ID number for funding purposes. So please do not, if you're submitting more than one project, please do not describe more than one project in one application. Please submit those as 2 separate applications. Again, the funds will be distributed and announced in November, pending everyone signing a grant agreement. And we will, once we make the announcement about, who will be funded, we will have another webinar to talk about the reporting requirements and the monitoring plans and things like that for this process. Again, funds have to be obligated by the end of 2024 and spent by the end of 2026. All money that is not spent will go back to the federal government. It will come back to us and we will then send it back to the federal government. There is regular reporting, as we've mentioned 100 times, and Gabby is going to talk about that in a moment. We are asking for the county itself, we're asking for one final narrative report due January 31st, 2025. And if you've received other COVID relief funds from us in the past, then this will be very familiar to you. We're looking for just who your nonprofit is, what you received from us, and then how you used it. The successes and challenges of using those funds for your program, any other ongoing or outstanding needs for your program. So as that date approaches, I will be in regular contact with you to make sure that you know it's coming, to give you those questions in a Word document so that you can answer them. And that is just a Baltimore County report. That is not the federal government treasury reporting, which Gabby will talk about. So I'm going to hand it over to Gabby, and I will move the slides for you.
Thank you very much. Yes, we're at the most exciting portion of this presentation, which is reporting. For those of you who are able to join our webinar before, this slide probably looks familiar. We are going to have, Treasury requires these two reports be submitted to us each year. The project and expenditure report is quarterly, and the recovery plan performance report is an annual report. Treasury is continuing to update their compliance and reporting guidance. So as we go, things may change as they continue to make those updates. But in general, the project and expenditure report is just that. You'll talk about the projects that we have funded, your expenditures with those, and the project status. And the recovery plan performance report is a more overall view of your program and how you're planning to ensure your program outcomes are achieved, as well as your key performance indicators, identifying those key performance indicators. We can go on to the next slide. So the reporting timeline for these reports, and as you'll remember, this will be a question in your application as well. The project and expenditure report is due on the last day of each quarter, and the recovery plan performance report is due 30 days after receiving funding and annually thereafter by June 30th. Now, there may be additional reports that we are going to require you to submit based on your project's monitoring plan. And I'm going to get into what the monitoring plans are in just a moment. But as Ashley reinforced earlier, these reports are really important. They all go to the Treasury, and we do need to get them submitted in a timely manner. So if you are not submitting your report to us within 24 hours of the due date, that may result in you having to forfeit your funds. And again, these reports are going to include things like regular expenditures, equity, project outcomes, project status, etc. So you can go on to the next one. Monitoring and risk assessment. So we are going to be establishing monitoring plans for each of your projects based on your organization's risk assessment. Risk assessments are required by the federal government with ARPA funds. So we are going to be looking at both your likelihood of risk, how likely it is that your project and organization can comply with federal regulations, as Ashley said, be good stewards of these funds, and the impact of that risk. So for example, that might look something like the likelihood of risk could be if you do not have very strong management systems in place to manage these funds, that may result in funds being underspent and then having to return a certain portion of those grant funds. Now, if your organization receives a high risk score, and we're going to get into what those look like, and we're going to show you the questions that we're going to be looking at for the risk assessment. That does not mean that your project will not be funded. We are not doing this to say, oh, we're not going to fund this project because it's too risky. It does mean that your project is going to have a stronger monitoring plan. And monitoring plans could look like you filling out monthly reports in addition to those quarterly and annual reports. It could look like you having monthly phone calls with our office or submitting reports every 2 months. It's really going to depend on where you score on that risk level and how we feel is the best way to move forward with your project. And this is just to ensure that your project is successful and that you're able to do all of the things that you want to do with these funds. And these will be completed throughout the life cycle of the project and can change. So even if your organization starts with a project that is considered high risk, it doesn't necessarily mean that throughout the life cycle of that project, it will continue to be high risk. We're going to do these throughout, and we may ask at some point that your organization completes your own risk assessment based on how your project has been going. We can go to the next slide.
And I will just say that we're required to do these risk assessments by the federal government, which is another reason why we're doing them.
Okay, so the first question we're going to ask on the risk assessment is, how much money, or the first question we're going to look at on the risk assessment. And let me be clear, since I don't think I said this yet, we will be completing these risk assessments. You will not be completing them, but we're showing you this to give you an idea of what we're looking for. And you'll notice that a lot of the questions in the risk assessment correspond to questions from the application. So that being said, getting into the requested amounts, the scores go up higher. We're looking at this like golf scores. A low score eventually will be low risk. A higher score will be higher risk. I'm not a golfer, so that's the only metaphor I can make here. But just because your project is an expensive project, that does not necessarily mean, again, that it won't be funded, but it does mean that you are spending more money. There are more federal dollars at play, so that is considered to be a higher level of risk. We can go to the next one. COVID-19 impacts. Ashley already hammered this one home pretty well, so I'm not going to get super into detail on these, but the really important thing to remember here is that these funds have to be going to the effects and impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. So if your project is not clearly identifying those effects or does not have a response that's mitigating those effects, that's going to be higher risk because we cannot be certain that those funds are going to be used appropriately per the federal requirements. We can go to the next slide. The project timeline. This gets back to kind of those reporting things as well that Ashley was mentioning. We want to see that it's detailed. We want to see your milestones, and we want to know how you are going to ensure that you're going to make those specific reporting dates. So not only do we want to see that you know what the reporting dates are, but we want to see that you have a plan in place for ensuring that you're hitting that deadline. We can jump to the next. Sorry, they look the same. My apologies. Project clarity. So we want to get a strong understanding of what your project is. As we're reading this, we should have a really good idea of what your project is, how you're implementing it, and what a successful project is going to look like for you. And the more detailed your project is, the less risky for us it is considered, because we know that you understand your project fully and you have thought it through and have things in place that you will be measuring, monitoring, and looking for. We can jump to the next. Project tracking. Again, this ties in with project clarity and something a little bit with the reporting, but we want to make sure that you have strategies in place to meet your goals and that you are aware of what you're going to do to ensure that those goals are met and have that defined for you, what that looks like for your project. And yeah. Key management systems. These are going to start getting a little bit longer. I apologize in advance. They get a little more detailed as we go. So key management systems, this is something you'll recognize from your pre-proposal as well. We asked about your management systems. We want to ensure that you have the best tools in place to make sure that this project is successful. So as Ashley mentioned before, this could be if you have project management software, if you're utilizing certifications from project management professionals. We want to know all of that. We want to know which best practices you're utilizing and how you're going to be utilizing them so that we know that your project will be managed efficiently and everything will be done within the timeframes that are set. Risk identification, probably the scariest one of all of these. We do want you to identify risks that are real and realistic for your project. We're going to be looking at those risks that you identify and seeing how much of a concern they pose for the project execution or completion. And that can look like, is this risk something that's going to delay the project significantly, either in hitting a reporting deadline or meeting a milestone or getting funds out the door? Again, as we said, this is not necessarily going to prohibit you from getting funds. It's just going to ensure that we monitor more strictly to ensure that funds are being spent in the way that you want to spend them efficiently and getting this money out the door to the residents to you and then to the residents of Baltimore County, getting that support out there. And then risk management. So we're looking at the risk that you've identified and the strategies you've employed to manage that risk. And we want to make sure that those are clearly defined and that they make sense with that risk. So when you're thinking about your risk management strategies and the risk that you're identifying, make sure that the things that you're putting in place align with one another, that they make sense together, and that they are reasonable for your organization to take on. Okay, so this slide has a lot of text on it, but basically this is how we're going to score you. So you saw all the numbers in those. Again, this is like golf scores. So a score of 21 and above would be a high risk program. That means that a strict monitoring plan will be required to ensure compliance with federal regulations and reporting. A mid-level program will require some form of monitoring plan that's a little bit stronger to ensure compliance with federal regulations. And a low score might not have any monitoring plan outside of the required quarterly and annual report. All of this is going to be based on what we see when we go through your project, what your risk assessment score is. And again, it does not preclude you from getting funded. It just means that we're going to be working more closely with you to ensure that you're meeting all these deadlines. And as I said before, these scores can change throughout the life cycle of your project. So if you start with a high score, later you may have a low score, and the same can be said. If you start with a low score, you might later raise up to a medium or a high score due to unprecedented things such as turnover on your team or grant software changing. So don't let this risk assessment scare you. We will be sharing it with you as well in a document so that you have it on hand when you are completing your applications so that you can see it and know what we're looking for. But this is why we're really trying to ensure that everything that you submit to us is detailed, and the risk assessment, as Ashley said, is a federal requirement, but helps us to ensure that you have thoroughly thought through your project, that you know what your milestones are, you know how you're going to achieve the things that you want to achieve, and you know that it is addressing the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, and you are prepared for any sort of fallouts that might happen.
So this is the end of our presentation. Again, this is our contact information, which all of you have by now. I've included Maya Smith's contact information for any tech support issues that you're having with the portal. Gabby and I are here to answer questions you have about the nature of your applications. And Maya is there to answer any sort of just, I can't get it to open, or I got locked out, or what have you. Like Gabby said, you know, we will give out the risk assessment to all of you, so you have a copy when you are completing your application on hand, so that you can, you know, complete it and make sure that you're hitting everything that, you know, we're looking at in terms of risk. When it comes to reviewing your applications for funding, we're going to be using similar questions to the risk assessment, not the risk assessment itself, because again, as Gabby said, your level of risk doesn't mean you won't be funded. It just affects how much monitoring we will have to do with you. And once we make award decisions in the fall, we will reach out to all of the organizations that are being awarded funds and talk to you about, you know, what your monitoring plan will look like in advance, what, you know, that might mean for you. And that will all have been, you know, discussed prior to anyone signing their grant agreements. We will have one more webinar at that time so that we can walk through, you know, the nitty gritty about reporting, because we want to make sure that you have all of the facts before you sign the paper and take the money, because there are just a lot of requirements that come with this from the federal government. So we want to make sure we put everyone in the best possible place before, you know, we move forward. So I think now would be a good time to go through some questions. I see a few that came to me privately. Gabby, do you have any that came to you privately?
I don't, I just have the one that's in the Q&A, or the two that are in the Q&A, but they are related.
And Ashley, I'm sorry, I wanted to chime in real quickly before you got into the questions.
Sure.
I apologize to everyone that I joined late. I'm Jasmine Clemens, Chief of Policy and Recovery Impact. So I'm helping the county executive lead and properly expend and make sure we're helping the county's most disproportionately impacted residents not only recover, but come ahead after the COVID pandemic. So I'm integrally involved in this process, but I'm grateful so much to Ashley and Gabby for managing the grants portion of this. I will be assisting in this, not just because of my role, but because I also have a prior life in federal grant making. So I just wanted to touch in just for everyone, because I have experience with grantees and everyone kind of gets scared when you get to the sub-recipient monitoring and the pre-award risk. Just to reiterate, the risk assessment is not to preclude you from getting funding. It just gives us advice on how we need to set up a plan to collaborate throughout the life of your grant, to make sure all the documentation's there, to make sure the spending's, in the right areas and etc. So if you've never gotten federal money before, that's fine. We're all going to work together to make sure that you know what you need to do. And, oftentimes you can quickly rectify things. So it's not that if you make one mistake, give all the money back. No, this is not a punitive process. It's more of, I like to look at it as like an auditing process, just how you would have a financial auditor come in and take a look at your work. We're going to be in helping you abide by the same rules that we have to abide by. So that's really what it is. It's not to play gotcha. It's not to be punitive at all, but it's to make sure that you get the help you need to get these programs off the ground and help our residents. And we also abide by the federal requirements that seem daunting, but once you get in the role of things, it's pretty simple. So we'll have a monitoring plan, like she said, for everyone, and they will be more or less tailored to what the risk assessment shows us in capacity. And it could change. You could start off needing monthly visits, monthly calls, and we see you doing a great job. That could shift to quarterly. You could start it quarterly and you might hit a hiccup and we have to shift back to monthly. That's fine. That's what we're here for. But everyone that receives this money will at least have one check-in. That's just basically the floor for federal funding is, even if you are, I don't even know, a federal money machine and you could do this in your sleep, we're going to at least check in one time. So no one's kind of going to be off the hook, but the point is to make this more burdensome, is to make sure that you're doing it right and that nothing happens at the end, because it's easier to correct when you're in progress rather than during closeout. So I just wanted to say all that because we don't want to scare anyone away from applying. We just want you to know that there is what I like to call hand holding, because we're in this together. If you're awarded, you're basically an extension of Baltimore County when it comes to this funding. So we want to make sure you're spending it right, and the federal government requires us to make sure you're spending it right, because we can't just say, oh, we give them money and the instructions, they did it. No, that's poor fiscal management. That's poor management of people's taxpayer funds. So I'll stop talking now, but wanted to just chime in after the rightful scariness that they portrayed to let you all know. Don't be scared. I'm here for you. We're here for you.
We're really, really excited to get this money out the door. I don't know if that came across clearly in everything we've just said. Okay, let's go through the Q&A and then we can hit the chat with questions. Please, I think because this seemed to be a little bit more streamlined last time, just adding the questions into the chat or the Q&A. Let's just go ahead and do that rather than unmic people. And we will just, Gabby and I will, and Jasmine, to the extent that she's available, we will stick around to answer all of the questions until there are no more questions. So Gabby, I'm going to say go ahead and start with the Q&A.
I am muted. Okay, so our first question is, can we make small tweaks to the project that we identified in stage 1? For example, is it okay to scale back on what we proposed in light of the fact that there is not a lot of funding for the number of applicants?
Yes. So again, you have to submit the same projects that you submitted in round 1. It cannot be a completely new project. But if you want to scale back the scope of that project, that is absolutely fine. I think that is a good practice, just considering that we need to make sure we are being as responsible with the money as possible, knowing that if you are funded, you're likely to get partial funding. If you wanted to scale back, that is fine. And again, if you wanted to, if you submitted more than one project and you wanted to just take that down to one of your three or two of your three, that's fine as well.
Can the budget include indirect / F&A rate?
Yes, indirect costs are eligible per uniform guidance. I think I saw this question floating in there. Yes, this will largely be abiding by full uniform guidance, which includes indirect costs. They are time consuming, so you kind of try to like limit those. So unless you have already have a negotiated rate with the federal government, you have to go by the standard cost principles, which I believe I think everyone should look this up before they say it in their thing, but I believe it's 10%, but don't quote me. I just drew a blank on it, but yes, so unless you already have a negotiated rate with the federal government, you have to go by the uniform guidance set rate.
I think this next question might even tie into that, Jasmine. One note from last webinar said that our request can't exceed 20% of the budget. Is that the project budget or the organization's budget?
Sorry. Oh, so yes, your project request cannot exceed 20% of your organizational budget. So let's say your organization brings in our annual budget. Let's say your organization brings in 100,000 annually. You should ask for $20,000 project. You shouldn't ask for 50 or 100,000 because your fiscal capacity that's beyond what you typically have.
Can we meet with you to discuss our project and get feedback about how we can make our proposal as strong as possible?
I let us talk about that internally and get back to all of you. And when we make a decision, we will let all of you know. I want to make sure, I think we all want to make sure that we give everyone an equal opportunity. So we just need to talk about what that might look like.
Yes. So, I mean, we'll talk offline, but if we do something, it'd be something everyone could attend, like a technical assistance hour or something. So that way it's equitable and no one gets, like we like to say, unfair advantage.
Right.
And I will take notes on just so everyone's aware of all the questions that we get that we're not answering here to ensure that we follow up and answer them. This person says, I have a question regarding the budget. Is there a percentage allocated to indirect costs?
So the indirect cost is limited, just to reiterate, unless you have a negotiated rate with a federal agency. I believe the de minimis rate is 10% for indirect costs. And that's in CFR CFR 200, which is the uniform guidance.
This question says, I was not clear in my earlier question directed to Ashley. I did not see a specific question asking us to list any COVID relief funds or Baltimore County funds in the portal. Are we supposed to answer that as part of the organization background question? Perhaps I missed it.
That question should be in there. When we went over the portal as we were building it, that we made sure that the COVID question and the Baltimore County questions were in there. So if you're not seeing it, shoot us an email at GRSI Partners and we will look into that ASAP because that question should be there. And again, if it's not there and we aren't able to fix it, we will let all of you know how to answer it going forward. So like I said, and Gabby said, and Jasmine said, whatever, moving forward, whatever changes need to be made, we will make sure everybody knows at the, same time so we can all be on the same page. But that question should be there.
Okay, I'm going to jump over to the chat because those are the last of the ones I see in the Q&A. So, second to migrate around. Okay, given the limited amount of grant funds available, is there a recommended maximum level for our request?
I would say no, because we want to get an idea of what the needs are out there in the county in general. So I don't think we agreed at the beginning when we were putting this program together that there wasn't a maximum cap. So, I would just keep in mind that that we aren't going to be able to fully fund most of these projects, if any. So just make sure that when you submit your project, you are submitting a project that you can complete if you were to get partial funding.
Will awarded organizations need to comply with the federal 2 CFR 200 or uniform guidance for reporting? And how much time will they have to adjust policies if needed? Are there resources from the county, such as examples of appropriate policies, etc.? I can take the bare bones of this. Yes, you will need to comply with the uniform guidance. I will toss it over to Jasmine or Ashley for the remainder.
Yeah, so as a reminder, so you would be a sub-recipient for the county. So the bulk of actually the reporting goes to the county. We will ask you for some information that's required for our quarterly report, depending on what your project is, but definitely for our annual reports. But if there's anything additional that applies to you, I know there's auditing, reporting requirements if you get above a certain amount. Yes, those apply to you. Otherwise, as a subrecipient to us, we'll be doing the bulk of the reporting, and you will know what you have to report to us as part of our treasury report.
And just to address that, are there resources from the county? As Ashley said, once we have announced the funding, we'll be hosting another webinar to talk more in detail about reporting.
Yeah, additionally, I want to remind everyone about the direct and indirect costs. So if there are costs associated for you managing these grants and managing these funds and time you're going to be charging to individuals you're staffing, you should charge them appropriately and have that in your budget, because direct and indirect costs are eligible because you need money to spend it, right? So keep that in mind.
Okay, I'm back in the Q&A. If our project is fiscally sponsored, is the request cap of 20% of annual budget, 20% of the fiscal sponsor's budget, or 20% of the fiscally sponsored project's budget?
That's a Jasmine question.
That's a good one.
It sounds like this is one we'll follow up on.
What's most appropriate is honestly, it's just 20% of the sponsee. I don't even think that's a word. The entity being sponsored, it should be 20% of your budget, because your fiscal sponsor is basically, for lack of a better term, a co-signer, right, on this grant. But you're ultimately responsible for it. They're going to back in case things fall apart, and we'll come up with that in the sub-monitoring plan. But the best practice is for it to be 20% of the entity being sponsored, because what you're doing, once again, is trying to build up your capacity.
Great. Those are all the questions I have right now. So if you have anything else, please feel free to throw it in the Q&A.
I have a few that came to me, so I'm going to just run through them out loud.
Go ahead.
Ones that we haven't already covered. I just scrolled right past it. Will the listing of previous COVID financial support and Baltimore County support repopulate in multiple applications? I don't believe so. I believe the only information that repopulates is your organization level information, address, email, contact. That information will probably have to be re-entered, but we will double check with Maya about that and get back to everybody.
And I do believe you should be able to copy and paste into the form. So a good practice that I've just developed in my personal life when doing a lot of online forms, if you want to put that stuff into a Word document, so at least you don't have to retype it each time, you should be able to copy and paste that into there, I believe. If you are not, I apologize for misspeaking.
Okay, next question is, we usually don't close our books until at least 15 days into the next month. Can it be a provisional amount in the expenditure report? That I think we will have to just get more into some of that as we get further into this process and we actually start talking about the details of reporting. I think that is a question that we just can't answer right now unless Jasmine wants to answer it.
I can answer it. So, because I actually sent a pin about this, that is not unusual for people to need 2 weeks to reconcile after a financial quarter. The county does the same. So that would be part of just your subrecipient monitoring and reporting timeline. For most people, maybe we might need to change that for everyone to be a 2-week reconciliation grace period, but it would be a firm 2 weeks because the treasury reports are due 30 days after the quarter ends because they give us very little grace.
Yeah, to give everyone here a little bit of background, the dates that we set up for you to turn your reports into us are, if I'm recalling correctly, a month in advance of the dates that we have to submit things to Treasury. So we are trying to make sure that we are able to get all that information with enough time for us to compile our reports.
Okay, our next question is a math problem, so bear with me. If I submitted 3 proposals and my organization income is 500,000, then the sum of my 3 parts can't be more than 100,000, or can each be up to that limit, and then we, the county, will determine which ones get funded.
So it sounds like they're going to apply. So they're going to apply for multiple things. So there's, and actually, sorry to cut you off. I think there's multiple ways to do this. You could submit them all up to your full 20% and rank them in terms of, priority. If you would like to do all 3, you should definitely proportion them to your full 20%.
See what other, can this be recorded and sent to all participants? Yes, it will be recorded and sent to all participants, along with a copy of the risk assessment and a hard copy of these slides. Another person is signing to say, I just checked. I also do not see the COVID funding required in the portal application. We will follow up on that immediately and get back to all of you. If we do need the information, so if it turns out that we can't fix that for whatever reason, we will let you all know to just answer it within a different question.
Thank you for checking that so quickly.
Yes, we appreciate that. Okay.
So those are still all the ones I have. So
I have a few more that came into me directly. Can you confirm that we could submit additional words in any attachment for any of the questions on the application the way it was worded in the BCF portal? It seems like that option was only available for the question asking for a description of the performance management plan. You can submit all longer answers to all of those questions if you want to do so, and just make sure that they're identified which question they are. So please just, when you name your document or put a header on it, please say your organization, nonprofit X, project Y, organizational background, or something like that. All of you are coming back and saying you don't see the COVID question. We will fix that. I appreciate everybody being so on top of that. Next question I have, this one might not have come to me privately. Will this all be emailed to us, or should we find it on your website? All of this will be emailed to you. So you may have, if you have checked our website recently, you will see that there's a banner on our ARPA nonprofit grant program page that lets you know that, we've moved on to this stage in the process, and everybody should have received an email letting them know whether or not they could submit a full application or whether they were not eligible to do so. If you haven't heard from us, if you're not getting emails from us, please email GRSI Partners with the email address that you check the most frequently, because we have in the past had people complete applications for COVID-19 support, given an email address that they then don't check, or that person who checks it has moved on, and we've had difficulty in communicating with those awardees. So that banner exists on the site just as a reminder to give us your most up-to-date email. And this would be another reason why too, because going forward, all of this information we are not putting on the website because it's just for the people who are moving through this stage. So you just make sure we have the most accurate email that you check the most frequently for this. And then I think that's everything. Oh,
I wanted, well, I guess while you got another question coming in, um, I, I'm drawing a blank on the name of the Maryland organization, but as nonprofits, if you have questions about federal funding, federal grant management, please look to your organizational nonprofits. I think Maryland Nonprofits has a great way to help. There's a ton of other kind of development centers that can assist because you will not be the first, nor will you be the last nonprofit to get federal money. So a lot of people have already developed like packages to explain this stuff and FAQs. So do not forget to reach out to your larger networks that support your entities because they have treasure troves of information and there's no need to recreate the wheel, you know? So don't forget that. Because as we're providing guidance, none of us are nonprofits or experts. I'm a governmental grant expert. I don't know what it's like to be a nonprofit and accept and expend this money. So just wanted to throw that out as looking for your resources for assistance.
We have another pseudo math question that came through the Q&A. If my calculations are correct, it looks like an organization must have an annual budget of at least $125,000. That effectively excludes small grassroots organizations with smaller budgets. Is that right? And I think this is referring to the 20% of your operating budget.
So I think that's a great flag for us because equity is key for us. And I think for you smaller nonprofits that have less money, particularly if you have a fiscal sponsor, reach out to Ashley and I. I think we can, on a case by case, make exceptions here because the purpose of this is not to exclude smaller entities because just because you don't have the big pockets doesn't mean you can't provide major help in the county. So reach out to us individually. I will say off the bat, if you have a fiscal sponsor, that'll probably let us say yes. If you don't, we'll have to look deeper or encourage you to get a fiscal sponsor because once again, we want to make sure you have all the tools in place to succeed if you get a grant.
Those are all the questions that I see so far. I haven't seen anything else come up in the chat or the Q&A.
I'm not seeing anything new either. So I think we are happy to stay on if anybody has more questions. We will stay until the last person goes. To reiterate, this will be distributed to all of you along with the risk assessment, along with hard copies of these slides. The actual recording may take a few days as we get it up onto our YouTube page. Any of the questions that were outstanding, we've taken notes throughout this and we will get answers to those. We will let you all know what to do about the COVID-19 financial situation on the portal and the Baltimore County financial situation on the portal, but just know you do have to answer those questions. And again, as Jasmine said, if you're a smaller organization underneath that $125,000 threshold, start with an email to GRSI partners, and then we will go from there. As all of you know, Gabby and I monitor it in real time. It's not an info at email, so just start with an email to us at that email address, and then we'll go from there and direct you to the right people. And then again, any questions that we didn't answer today, you can email us at any time, and we'll get you an answer.
So we are getting a couple more questions trickling through. So as Ashley said, if you have to jump off, please feel free, but we are going to be sticking around to answer any questions that come through until everyone is left. Do you have a budget template or can we use what we have?
You can use what you have. An Excel form is fine. PDF is fine. Whatever form you already have that is easy for you, as long as it is very clear and specific. We have received budgets in the past for COVID grant programs where the budget is very, very vague, maybe 3 items, just general you know, A, B, and C, and we just need you to be as detailed as possible with your budgets.
And to reiterate that detail, we kind of touched on it with people asking about the indirect and direct costs and having, you know, support for all the budgeting and reporting requirements. To get that funded, you need to have it in the budget. So break it out. No detail is too small. The more you give us, the more we're going to believe in your capacity to execute, because that means you put the thought into what it's going to take.
We had someone ask, can you please put, yep, it looks like you already saw it. We're also, are we sharing this slide deck as well, Ashley?
Yep. We'll send this whole deck out to you as a PDF the way we've done before. I think
you'll be able to see it as well.
Right. And I think what you might be asking right now is for this particular slide, since this is where the questions seem to be up in the air. So I'll just put this slide up, and if that's not the right one, I can move it over. But we will send this out to you.
Nothing else on my end so far.
Yeah, I did want to throw out something that's often overlooked in these kind of applications. If you have a robust board structure and, you know, these are technically paid or unpaid advisors to your nonprofit, highlight them in your application, because that shows that not only, I mean, boards are great governance structures, but they're also great resources to successfully sometimes are great resources for successfully expending grants. So don't forget to shine like those other elements beyond what we're telling you technically. And Ashley, please forgive me. Are we allowing letters of support?
No, they're not necessary.
So they're not necessary, but if you want to throw them in there, I think letters of support from stakeholders, community groups, others are also excellent assets, but not required.
So to that point, we got a question earlier about that, and there is not a place to submit them in the application. So if you do feel so inclined, you can send them to GRSI partners when you submit your application. However, as we said, they're not required. They're not a part of the application portal. So do not need to do them. Okay, well, I think that is probably it. We're not getting any new questions. So we'll just go ahead and stay here, wait for everybody to filter off, but thank you all so much.